Paul was a very handsome boy. He had big blue eyes, shiny brown hair, and a bright smile. Everyone at school liked Paul because he was kind and friendly. But there was something special about Paul. He loved to share his cookies. Every day Paul brought a big jar of cookies to school. The cookies were round, soft, and smelled so sweet. All the children in school wanted to eat Paul's cookies. "Paul, can I have a cookie?" a little girl named Sarah asked. "Of course," Paul said with a big smile. He gave Sarah a cookie. "Paul, I want one too," said Tom. Paul laughed. "Here you go, Tom." All the children who got a cookie were happy. They ate the cookies and licked their fingers. "Paul's cookies are the best," they said. That night something strange happened. Sarah went to bed after eating the cookie. She closed her eyes and slept. But soon she had a terrible nightmare. Sarah was in a dark forest. The trees were tall and black. There was no moon, no stars, only darkness. Suddenly she heard a whisper. Sarah." She turned around. No one was there. Then she heard footsteps. They were coming closer. She wanted to run, but her feet did not move. The footsteps stopped and she saw a shadow. The shadow had big blue eyes and shiny brown hair. "Who's Paul?" "Why are you here, Paul?" Sarah asked, scared. Paul did not answer. His face changed. His bright smile turned into a big dark mouth. His eyes became black. He walked closer to Sarah. Sarah screamed and woke up. She was sweating. It was just a dream. But it felt so real. The next morning, Sarah told Tom about her nightmare. Tom's face turned white. "I had the same dream," he said. "I was in a dark forest. I heard footsteps. Then I saw Paul. But he was different. He was scary." Sarah and Tom looked at each other. "Do you think it's because of the cookies?" Sarah whispered. That day Paul brought more cookies. He smiled and gave them to the children. "Do you want a cookie?" Paul asked Jenny. Jenny shook her head. "No thank you." Paul looked surprised. "Why not? My cookies are the best." Jenny looked at Sarah and Tom. Then she said, "I don't feel like eating a cookie today." Paul laughed. "Okay." But his blue eyes looked darker. More children started saying no to Paul's cookies. But some children still ate them. Every night the children who ate the cookies had nightmares. They saw Paul in the dark forest. His smile was scary. His eyes were black. He whispered their names in the dark. One day Sarah and Tom decided to find out the truth. After school they followed Paul home. Paul lived in a small house near the forest. They watched him from behind a tree. Paul went inside the house. He opened a big cupboard. Sarah and Tom saw something strange. The cupboard was full of cookie jars. But there was something inside the jars. Something dark. Something moving. Paul took a jar and opened it. A black smoke came out. The smoke turned into a shadow. The shadow looked like Paul. It had big black eyes and a dark mouth. Paul whispered something and the shadow went back into the jar. Sarah and Tom looked at each other. They were very scared. "We have to stop Paul," Sarah said. "But how?" Tom asked. Sarah thought for a moment. Then she had an idea. "We need to break the jars." That night they waited until Paul was asleep. They went into his house. It was dark and quiet. The cupboard with the cookie jars was in the kitchen. Sarah and Tom carefully opened the cupboard. There were so many jars. Each jar had a shadow inside. The shadows moved like they were alive. Tom took a big stone. "Let's break them," he whispered. Sarah nodded. She took another stone. Together they smashed the jars. The shadows came out and disappeared into the air. The kitchen was filled with black smoke. Then they heard a noise. Paul woke up. "What are you doing?" Paul asked. His voice was not friendly. His eyes were black now. Sarah and Tom ran. They ran as fast as they could. Paul ran after them, but he was too slow. When they reached the school they stopped. They looked back. Paul was gone. The next day Paul did not come to school. The children waited, but he never came back. And the nightmares stopped. No one ever saw Paul again. But sometimes at night when the wind blew through the trees, the children heard a whisper. One night Sarah felt very tired. She went to bed early. As soon as she closed her eyes, she felt light. She opened her eyes and saw her body lying on the bed. She was floating. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then she saw Tom. He was floating too. "What's happening?" Tom asked. His voice sounded distant. "I don't know," Sarah said. Then, as if pulled by an invisible force, they started moving. They floated out of their houses and into the night. They saw other children also floating. All of them were going in the same direction, toward the forest. The trees were tall and black. The air was cold. The children landed in a circle. In the middle of the circle there was a shadow. It had black eyes and a dark mouth. "Who's Paul?" "Welcome," Paul whispered. "I was waiting for you." The children wanted to run but they could not move. Paul's shadow grew bigger. "You freed the spirits from the jars," Paul said. "But now you belong to me." The children looked at each other. Their spirits were trapped in the forest. And the night was just beginning. Sarah's heart pounded as Paul's shadow loomed over them. The cold air wrapped around her like icy fingers, sending shivers down her spine. The other children whimpered, their voices barely above a whisper. "No," Sarah said, her voice shaking but firm. "We won't belong to you." Paul's dark smile widened. "You already do." The ground beneath them trembled and the forest came alive. Shadows slithered between the trees, whispering their names. Sarah felt something tugging at her feet, trying to pull her down into the darkness. She struggled, but it was no use. Tom grabbed her hand. "We have to fight," he said, his grip tight. "We destroyed the jars. There has to be a way to stop him." Sarah looked around. The children's spirits were flickering like candle flames, growing dimmer with every second. She had to think fast. Then she remembered. Cookies. The cookies were what connected Paul's power to them. If the cookies gave them nightmares, maybe they could be used against him. "Everyone, think about the cookies," Sarah shouted. "Think about the taste, the smell, everything." The children hesitated, but then they did as she said. They closed their eyes and focused. The memory of the cookies filled the air, the sweet scent of sugar and butter, the warmth of freshly baked dough. The darkness around them wavered. Paul's smile faltered. "Stop that," he hissed, his voice distorting. Sarah clenched her fists. "No, you tricked us, Paul. You fed us nightmares. But we're not afraid anymore." Tom joined her. "You're just a shadow. You don't control us." The other children echoed their words. Their spirits glowed brighter. Paul's shadow twisted and writhed, his black eyes widening in fear. "No," Paul screeched. "You belong to me. You." A burst of light erupted from the children, shattering the darkness. Paul let out a final ear-piercing scream as his shadow dissolved into the wind. The whispers stopped. The trees stood still. The night became silent. Sarah opened her eyes. She was back in her bed. The warmth of morning sunlight streamed through her window. For a moment she thought it had all been a dream. Then she saw Tom standing outside her house, his eyes wide with understanding. Sarah and Tom exchanged uneasy glances. The morning sunlight felt warm, but an unsettling chill still clung to them. Paul was gone for now. But what if he came back? "We need to find a way to stop him forever," Tom said, his voice firm. Sarah nodded. "But how? We don't even know what he really was." The two hurried to school, where they gathered the other children who had been trapped in Paul's nightmare. They met in the empty library, whispering in hushed voices. "We broke the jars," Jenny said. "That should have stopped him, right?" Tom shook his head. "But he still found a way to pull us into the forest." Sarah tapped her fingers on the wooden table. What if Paul wasn't just a boy? What if he was something older? Something that needed those cookies to trap us? The children shivered. The idea was terrifying, but it made sense. Paul had always been different. He had never mentioned his parents, and no one had ever seen where he came from before he joined their school. "We need to find out who Paul really was," Sarah decided. "And for that we need to go back to his house." The group hesitated. Going back there felt dangerous, but they knew it was the only way. That evening, just before sunset, Sarah, Tom, Jenny, and a few others crept toward Paul's abandoned house. The small wooden structure looked more fragile now, as if it had aged overnight. The windows were dark, the air thick with an eerie silence. They stepped inside, their footsteps echoing. The scent of old cookies still lingered in the air, mixed with something rotten. "Check the cupboards," Sarah whispered. They searched the kitchen first. The broken jars lay scattered on the floor, black stains marking where the shadows had once been. Jenny opened a drawer and gasped. "Look at this," she said, holding up a yellowed piece of paper. It was a recipe written in smudged ink. "Cookies of the lost, 1 cup of sugar, 1 cup of butter, 1 cup of flour." The ingredients seemed normal, but as they read further, their stomachs turned. "One whisper from the void, One tear from a dreamer, one shadow from the past. These weren't just cookies, Tom whispered. They were spells. Sarah swallowed hard. Paul was feeding us magic. He was trapping our spirit so he could grow stronger. Jenny flipped the page over and found another note, scrawled hastily. The vessel must be bound before the moon fades. If the jars are broken, the spirit will seek new refuge. Destroy the source. Burn it all. The source, Sarah muttered. Paul's power didn't come from just the jars. It came from something bigger. A sudden crash made them jump. A gust of wind slammed the front door shut. The air inside grew colder. He knows we're here, Tom said. We have to find the source and destroy it now, Jenny cried. They ran through the house searching. Then behind the old stove Tom found a trapdoor. It leads underground, he said. The children hesitated. The darkness below seemed endless. Sarah took a deep breath. If we don't stop him now, he'll keep coming back. One by one they climbed down into the depths of the house. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something foul. Candles flickered along the dirt walls, their flames bending unnaturally. At the center of the room stood an altar. And on it, a heart, Jenny whispered, horrified. It wasn't a real heart. It was made of stone, black and pulsing like it was alive. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, glowing faintly. This is it, Sarah said. This is Paul's heart. It's what's keeping him here. But how do we destroy it? Tom asked. Sarah looked around. Then she saw a rusted iron poker leaning against the wall. She grabbed it and lifted it above her head. If fire worked on the jars, maybe it'll work on this. With all her strength, she brought the poker down on the stone heart. The moment it struck, the room shook violently. A wail filled the air, a voice they all knew too well. No, Paul's voice screamed. You can't. Cracks spread across the stone heart. The pulsing slowed. The shadows in the room twisted and writhed, trying to take shape, but they were fading. Sarah struck again, and again. The heart shattered. A deafening silence followed. The candle flames blew out. The air became still. And then, as if the world had exhaled, the oppressive weight of Paul's presence was gone. The children scrambled out of the basement. They ran outside, gasping for fresh air. The house, as if sensing its master's demise, creaked and groaned before collapsing in on itself. Jenny stared at the ruins. It's over, she whispered. Sarah wasn't so sure. But as they walked away, the wind did not whisper their names. The nightmares never returned. And Paul was never seen again. Years passed, and the memory of Paul faded into whispers and forgotten fears. The children who had once been trapped in his dark spell grew older, carrying with them the lesson of that fateful night. They never spoke of it again, but in their hearts, they knew they had faced something beyond their understanding and survived. Sarah and Tom remained close friends, bound by the secret they shared. Though they no longer feared the shadows, they always carried a lingering caution when night fell. The house where Paul once lived became nothing more than an overgrown ruin, nature reclaiming what had once been his domain. Some nights, when the wind howled through the trees, a whisper could still be heard in the distance. But it was not calling their names. It was just the past fading away like the last crumbs of a forgotten cookie. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling tales. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an amazing story like this. Your support helps us keep creating more interesting and engaging stories. Let us know in the comments what you think happened to Paul. And if you dare to eat one of his cookies, subscribe now and stay tuned for the next story.